So we're going to be going over MEL basics. I like MEL script a lot. Eventually I'll learn Python, but for now, MEL serves its purpose very well. It can speed up your workflow a ton. Anything basically that you have to do more than once, you don't have to do more than once anymore. You can do it one time if you are willing to learn MEL and figure out how to use all of its capacities. So, of the people we got here, who has any experience at all? That's not bad. That's a solid 50%. So because we got a lot of people who haven't touched it before, I'm going to start like from the very beginning. There might be a little bit of review. That's fine. You can always use a little bit of review. This editor I have here is the script editor. I have it in the side of Maya, but you may also see it in the front of Maya. I just think it's easier to see when you dock it. And every time you do anything in Maya, like make a NURB sphere, you will see it as a command in Maya with all these flags, and you can copy that line and run it again, and it does the exact same thing as pushing the button does. This is useful if like, oh, I need to do the same command over and over. I don't know anything about MEL, but I can just copy this line and do it over and over. And that's like one way you can speed up your workflow. Basically for this demo, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you guys how to make a pretty simple, really useful tool that I end up coding into like every Monty computer every time I use it, because I don't know how to work without it anymore. It's going to be a mass joint renaming tool. So say you have a bunch of joints in a chain, and they are all named stupid things like joint 1, and you want to name them with like a prefix you want and suffix you want and have them numbered correctly. This procedure I made, which I'm going to run, made it so you can just select all the joints and type into your command line, delete this, the command mass rename with whatever you want as the name, like cool joint, and you can run it, and it'll rename all your joints cool joint and the numbered suffix. It's really useful, because I'm making a manta ray in quadruped class, and that thing has absurd numbers of joint chains, and I don't want to go through and manually rename like, this is manta left wing dynamic joint number 17. And it's really simple because the only principles it really uses are using existing codes in Maya, like getting a selection set, which is pretty basic. You're going to need to do it for almost anything, and using a for loop, or actually it's a for in loop. I'll get into what that means in a second. So first off, I'll just show you guys how to rename one joint. I've made a joint. He's very small, so I'm going to actually turn that radius up on him. Yeah, here's my one joint named joint 1. If I wanted to rename him, I can just click here and rename him cool joint. And if you go into the script editor, you can find the command that you use to do that. It's rename joint 1 cool joint. That's cool. So if I wanted to do this on my own from the script editor or from the MEL command line on the bottom, if I wanted to name him nice joint instead, you just change this like attribute in the code and run it. Oh, there's an error. This is because we have hard-coded in joint 1 as the name, and it's looking for joint 1 in the outliner, but joint 1 doesn't exist anymore, only cool joint. This is part of the reason why we use variables. So you'll need to figure out exactly what the name of the thing you want to rename is, and then run your code. And then you've renamed it. But you don't want to like copy and paste this code every time you want to rename a cool joint. You want to be able to like refer to it in a vague manner, and that's where variables come in. When you're working with variables, you have to realize that in MEL and in all computer programming, there are different types of variables that hold different types of information. A variable is like a container, and if you have a milk jug, you can't hold cereal in it unless you're nasty. So you have to use the right container for the right data type. The main ones that you end up using are integers, which are like whole numbers, floating point numbers or floats, which is numbers that have decimals, strings, which just means any text information, booleans, which is a 1-0 true-false value, and arrays, which are basically any of those above variables, but in a list, so you can hold multiple variables with one container. And the script that we're going to make utilizes an integer for a counter, strings to get the names of the joints, and an array to hold multiple strings in one variable. If y'all have any questions, you can just raise your hand, flag me down, and I will do my best to answer them. So, in order to find joints in the scene, there's a very useful command. Oh, I should explain what commands are. We already sort of saw it, but like anything that highlights in blue when you're in the MEL window is a command. It means it's executing a pre-made code that's like a Maya code whenever you run it. So rename obviously renames a joint. If you write in delete, it'll delete whatever you are deleting. If you write in circle, it makes a NURB circle. There's all sorts of things, and the only way that you're going to memorize all the commands in Maya is don't do that. It's stupid. You can figure out commands by looking in the Maya documentation or by just running whatever tool you wanted to run manually. Like if I wanted to freeze the transformations on something and I wanted to do that from code, I would just do it in the modify window like normal. Except for some reason, it won't show me. That's a fun thing. Echo all commands in the history tab will show you more under the hood things that Maya is doing and not telling you. So yeah, there's our code. Freeze transformations. And so I could totally do that from the code editor, from the script editor. I'm going to turn off echo all commands because there are a lot of things that update every time you do anything in Maya. The other thing with commands is that they often have flags. Like say, if I wanted to do circle, I could just do circle. But if I wanted to do circle with a radius of like 5, you would have to add a flag telling the MEL command that the circle has a radius of 5. And the way you find out what flags are available to you, there's a couple of ways. The first thing is you can highlight any command and go into the quick help by holding your right mouse button and then dragging down to quick help. It pops up this little window on the side that tells you all the flags, both the abbreviated versions and the long versions that you have with this command. Like you can do like a sweep angle too, or you could do a what's the one that rotates it? I think it's like normal axis. Yeah. AX? No, it's not AX. I think it's NR. So I'll run a NR with 0, 1, 0, which should tell it to create the circle with its normal axis in the Y direction. That's X, Y, Z if you see a series of 3 variables. Yeah, there we go. Normal to the Y-axis. And we've made this cute little atom thing out of NURB circles. So, the only command we're going to be really using in our mass rename tool is going to be the rename command, obviously, the select command, which does exactly what it says. It just selects an object that you tell it to, and the list command, which is usually written as ls. And the list command is a really useful command in Maya because it basically goes through everything in the scene, everything in the outliner, to your specifications that you define with flags, and it creates, it assigns them to a variable for you. So, like, say, if I wanted to find all the things in my scene that are named starting with P-sphere, I would make a variable container to hold them. In MEL, all variables start with a $, and you have to define them. So if it's names, as anything you make with the ls commands is, you start with string, because that's text data, then a $, and whatever we want to name the variable. What should we name the variable? Yeet? I heard yeet. And then in backticks, because whenever you're using a command in variable assignment, you have to put it in backticks for MEL syntax. You would put ls, and then in quotation marks, P-sphere. And this should give us a list of everything. Oh, this is an array, by the way. You also have to put brackets if it's an array, and the ls command always returns an array. Then after that, I'm going to use the print command, which will, in our history, give us like a text of whatever we tell it to print. I'm going to tell it to print yeet. And on the second time, you don't have to put the brackets if you want to access the whole array. You only need to put the brackets if you're creating the array for the first time. So I'll run this code. Did I spell it wrong? I didn't get an error. Oh, I know. It's looking for an object specifically named P-sphere. I actually needed to put a question mark to tell it that we're also looking for any characters that have like P-sphere and a random number afterwards. So this should work. So then it prints out P-sphere 1, P-sphere 2, P-sphere 3, and P-sphere 4. Those are the 4 objects that it found in our scene that have the name P-sphere with a question mark. A nice thing also is the ls command has a flag that's -SL for select. And if you use -SL, it'll limit the list to only things you have selected. So I'll just select 2 of these spheres and run this code again. It only returns the first 2 spheres because only the first 2 spheres are selected. And you can imagine that's pretty useful when you're trying to make something that your user can interact with, because they can select what they're wanting to run the command on and then you run it. So for our mass rename tool, I'm going to use that ls command. First I'm going to make a joint chain that we can interact with. Yeah, that's pretty good. And I'm going to create a variable called string joints and make it equal to just ls-sl. So just list selected. List all the things that are selected. And this doesn't have to just rename joints. This will give you any object in Maya you have selected. It could be a shape node, it could be a transform node, whatever. I'm just calling it joints because we're doing it for joints. Then the next thing I'm going to do is make another variable that's a counter. And that counter is going to be what we're going to use to label the like ends of the joints. So we can get our joint 1, joint 2, joint 3. So integer counter equals, for now, let's set it to 1, because we want our first joint to be joint 1. Now, here is where coding gets really useful, because we're going to make a loop. A loop is any code that can, like, it runs the same commands over and over up until a specified point. And we're going to use, there's different kinds of loops. There's a while loop, which is basically do this while this value is less than this. And that's a good loop, but you can end up in a situation where you make it infinite because you make it impossible for it to ever reach its end condition. Nick did that earlier because he ran unfinished code and crashed Maya. So that's fun.
Never make an infinite loop if you want to keep working in Maya.
Yeah, and sometimes if you're using a while loop and you don't know if it's going to work, save. There's a for loop, which is basically an improvement on the while loop, because in order to make it, you have to have an end condition. You say, like, for a certain value is equal to 0, is less than 10, and every time the loop runs increases by 1. You have to have all 3 of those conditions for the loop syntax to work correctly, so it will never give you that infinite condition unless you're really creative. And then the one we're going to use is called a for in loop, and we're going to use it because this variable we have, the joints variable, is an array. A for in loop is do this once for every item in the array. And it's really useful for something like this, where we're selecting a number of objects that we're not sure how many there's going to be selected, and we just want to run it on every object in that array. So the syntax for a for in loop is you write for, you make a set of parentheses, and then you have to define like a variable, like a temp variable. I like to call it item in, and then you put the array. So item could be named anything. It could be named just I. It could be named like garbage. And then you put a curly brace, and you'll get a matching curly brace on the other side. Everything within these braces is going to be the code that's going to run over and over in our loop. So for this, the first thing I want to do to rename, and there's probably a nicer way to do this, but it's just simple. It's the way I think about Maya. First thing we're going to do is select item. But we could run into a problem with just saying select item. Can anyone think of what kind of problem we could run into? Not exactly. But you know how in Maya when you select something, it doesn't mean it deselects everything else. We have to add a flag that's going to say select and replace your selection rather than add to the selection, because by default it'll add to your existing selection. And we can find that that flag in the quick help. R or replace. I'll write it out just for clarity's sake. Usually I would just do R, but you can write out replace all the way if that suits your fancy. So this line of code will select the first item in joints array on its first time through the loop, and then the next time through the loop it'll select the next one, and the next time through the loop it'll select the next one, and so on and so forth. Then, can anyone guess what the next command we're going to run is? Yeah, you got it. That's why this is so simple, because it's basically select the thing and rename it. What we're going to have to do here is, later I will show you how to make it a procedure so you can define what the name you want every time, but for now we'll just say this is going to be named cool joint. But in order to get our numbering, we're going to have to do something called concatenation, where we combine a string that we type out with a variable that's going to change every time. So when you're doing concatenation, you have to put your whole thing in parentheses like it's an equation. We're going to add the counter number on the end each time through the loop. So you go cool joint plus, and then your variable, which for us is counter. I'm gonna squeech this out a little bit. And put a semicolon on the end. I don't know if I've said this because it's kind of common knowledge, but in MEL, put a semicolon on the end to end your line. And then, for our last line of code in this loop, we want to make it so our counter number can change each time it goes through the loop. So we're going to say our variable counter is equal to the existing value of counter plus 1. So that way, when it goes through the loop another time, it'll just like add to it. There's also a short way if you wanted to write this, you can just write plus plus counter. That's the syntax you would use if you were defining a for loop or if you just are lazy like me. So you'll see in like my other version of it, I just write it like that. So this code will actually work for basically what we want to do as long as you're wanting to name your joints cool joint. I'll select it. Hold on. Maya. Hello. Ugh. Great. I have this code, and I can also type it up in 5 seconds, so do not worry. Yeah, if somebody wants to time me. I actually have a reasonable amount of tea. I'm sorry I sound so scratchy. It's just like too many germs around, no Food and Drug Administration to prevent us from contracting them. What's up?
For the counter shortcut, does that only work if you want to add 1 to your variable?
Right, it's a shortcut for adding 1.
Okay.
You can also do minus minus if you want to subtract 1. Okay. Script editor.
So how did you get it to where you can just type in math rename?
I made a procedure. That's the next thing I'm going to show you.
Oh wait.
And procedures are nice because you can assign them to buttons or like they're just like one line of code that you can run in your command line whenever you want to use it. Let me get a new MEL tab. Okay, time me on this.
Wait.
Hmm?
Go.
String.
That's a meaningful reading.
Mhm. Okay, that's all the code we wrote.
Oh, 53.
53 seconds. So if you know what you're doing, that's reasonably fast. And I am not a very fast typer, so take that into account. Okay, I'm gonna make a joint chain and we're gonna test this. These guys are so small. Select. Look, they're all cool joint 1 through 5. Now, how can we make this slightly more practical? Joints don't always want to be named cool joint. So, we're going to make a procedure that's going to run this code except with an additional user-defined variable that changes every time we run it. The syntax for making a procedure is you're gonna type global proc and then the name, which I'm gonna call this a different name so it doesn't conflict with my existing procedure. I'll just call it joint rename. And then in these parentheses, you're going to put the kind of variable that you want the user to define every time. In our case, we want a string, and then a curly brace, and then another curly brace at the end of the code to close it off. And with procedure names, you don't usually want to use camel case because people will get it confused with variables, and so instead, you just use a capital letter in front of every word. Oh, this is actually the wrong syntax. You want to do string and then the name of the temp variable that you're going to put in. So I'll just write string name So then, where we've hard-coded in cool joint as our name, I'm just going to delete that, and instead, we'll put name. And so now, instead of naming it cool joint 1, it'll name it whatever we tell it to, plus the number. So, when you run a procedure, it doesn't actually run the code because you have to run the command for the code. This is just defining the procedure and telling Maya, here's a new command we have. We can run it in the MEL line now. If you haven't defined a procedure, it won't actually work for you, and you usually have to redefine it every time you open Maya. So, let's try it out. Joint, rename, and what do we want to name our joints? Yoink. That's it. We just run that. And now they're renamed. And that's 9 lines of code, and I use it like every day. It honestly should be a tool in Maya, and if it is there, I haven't found it. So, that's how you can use code in your workflow. It's super useful. Anyone got any questions? Yes.
Sorry if it's silly, I don't know much about this, but how would you custom rename just the numerical value in joints? So just like, I don't know, like a procedure that adds +1 to each joint in the hierarchy, but you get to choose what number to start at?
I have an alt version of this code that I actually make where instead of having, I have to rename this because Maya will not let you redefine a procedure with different variables in MEL. So I have to I'll make this joint rename with numbers. You add a second variable here, in which case it would be an integer. And I will call this int counter, the same integer we were using. So now you just say counter equals 1. No, you make a new one. I'll just call this count. And you say count equals counter, which we're getting from the user. And so you tell it basically what number to start at. And so for this version of it, when you're running it, you would basically just say joint rename with numbers. You put in your name, comma, and then you put in whatever number you want it to start at, 7. Did I typo that? With numbers. And now it goes from 7 to 11 instead of from 1 to 6 or whatever it was. So that's just adding a second variable to the procedure that you can customize. Scroll over. Yeah. There you go. Any other questions? All right. Thank you for being a good audience.